Today we're back at the Newfoundland Memorial Park, but we're not here to talk about the Newfoundland Regiment today. We're here to talk about some of the other units that fought here on the first day of the Battle at the Somme. Whenever you come here to Newfoundland Park, people of course will talk about the Newfoundland Regiment and the terrible losses that they suffered here on the first day of the Somme. Right now we're stood in the St John's Road trench. This is the trench that those men left from early that morning and suffered so many casualties as they headed forwards into no man's land. But what about the other men who attacked here on the first day of the Somme? The Newfoundland Regiment were actually in reserve. There were others that attacked ahead of them first here at 7:30 in the morning. Well, today I thought we would come here and talk about some of those other units and regiments that fought here. Of course, when you come here, it's important to talk about Newfoundland Regiment, and you will normally talk about that first. Of course, this is the Newfoundland Park. People like myself, the first video I made here was about that regiment. But I thought we should come here today and learn a little bit about some of the other guys who were here as well. Now, the Newfoundland Regiment who attacked here were part of the wider 29th Division. And when you come into the Memorial Park, you have the 29th Division Memorial straight here ahead of us. The 29th Division served in Gallipoli in 1915 and then briefly in Egypt before moving over here to France on the Western Front in early 1916. They arrived in this area, or at least the area near here, in about March, a few months prior to the attack here on the 1st of July. So I've just come up to take in the view, the oddly beautiful view that you get here when you think what a tragic place this is. I've just come up to the Caribou Memorial. The reason I've come up here is you get a really good idea here and a good view of what we're talking about. So the men of the 29th Division were here ready to attack on the first day of the Somme. Now, when you're here at Newfoundland Park, some people get a bit confused with the trenches, but the frontline trench is actually this one over here, just on the other side of the path. And in that trench, ready to go into the attack on the first day of the Somme, were men of the 2nd South Wales Borderers. They were going to be first over the top here at 7:30 in the morning. Behind them you have the reserve line trench just running through here, and this trench here was full of men from the 1st Border Regiment. They were going to be the second wave of the attack here. Further back we had the reserve trench, the St John's Road trench, which is where men of the Newfoundland Regiment were ready to go into the attack in the reserve line. Of course, the idea being that they might not even be needed. The men who suffered such a horrible fate here on the 1st of July were in reserve. They weren't necessarily going to be going into the attack, but of course we already know that they did. And then on the right flank, in the reserve trenches back on this side, we had men of the 1st Essex Regiment. So that was the setup on this side of no man's land. Now, it would be wrong to come here and talk about the different units that fought without just talking about the other side of no man's land. People who haven't seen my videos from here before, the German front line is roughly kind of here. You can see a monument out there on the horizon. Well, that's pretty much where the German front line was. And over there were men of the 119th Infantry Reserve Regiment. And they were over there ready to defend this ground. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get across there. Okay, so we've just walked out a little further out from the memorial here, and we are in line with what was the British front line trench. So running up here to the left of us and to the right of us as well. This is where the front line was. So this is no man's land directly ahead of us. And at 7:30 in the morning, the whistles were going to blow, and men of the 2nd South Wales Borderers were going to go over the top here and attack towards the German trenches. Now, the men of the 2nd South Wales Borderers here had a bit of a job to do to get across no man's land. Of course, they had to deal with things like the German wire when they got to the far side. But even prior to that, they had to deal with the British wire. Now, of course, there was wire in front of the British trenches for defensive purposes as well. But channels had been cut into that by the engineers to enable those men to move up and through. The problem was, for that to happen, they had to funnel together to get through these gaps in the wire. Now, we already know from our previous talk and video on this channel, the Germans were ready to defend this attack. They hadn't been killed by the artillery bombardments as was expected. They were still there. They were setting up their machine guns. And once they realised the men were funneling together to get through these gaps in the wire, well, they started firing their machine guns directly at those gaps. The defences here hadn't really been softened in the way that had hoped. The German wire hadn't been destroyed in the way that had been hoped. And as the 2nd South Wales Borderers moved out here into no man's land, they were absolutely massacred. The official history of the 2nd South Wales Borderers says that they ceased to exist at 7:45. 7:45 in the morning, 15 minutes into the attack, and the 1st Battalion over the top has ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Of course, that meant that the 1st Border Regiment just behind them were going to be coming forwards into the attack. So the men of the 2nd South Wales Borderers had gone into the attack, and coming up, working their way through the trench just behind them, were the 1st Border Regiment. The men of the 1st Border Regiment were going to move forwards out of these trenches and attack just behind them. So from the 2nd line trenches here, the Border Regiment moved up and out into no man's land, and you can immediately see how exposed they became as they crossed towards the German line. Now, of course, the men of the 1st Border Regiment had the exact same challenges as that of the South Wales Borderers men. They had to head for those same gaps in the wire as well. But of course, by this stage, those gaps were becoming clogged up with wounded or dead men. As well as that, the Germans now had a clear line on where those South Wales Borderers men had been coming through, so they had their machine guns trained on those gaps in the wire. The 1st Border Regiment moved forwards here into the attack, and the official history of what happened here says that they ceased to exist as a fighting unit at about 8 o'clock in the morning. That's 30 minutes into the attack here. In 30 minutes, 2 of the battalions, the lead battalions into the fight here, have ceased to exist. And at that point, the decision was made to call up the reserve lines. The Newfoundland Regiment and the Essex Regiment were going to move forwards into the attack. By 8:45 in the morning here, this attack was going disastrously wrong. And that's the point where the Newfoundland Regiment were called up from the St John's Road trench here behind me. But that was actually the left flank of the reserves. On the right flank of the reserves over here, we had men of the Essex Regiment who were going to move forwards into the fight as well. Now, near the entrance to the Memorial Park, on your left, you have the St John's Road trench, the reserve line trench that ran out here. And over on the other side, you see a trench that continues in the opposite direction. Well, this was the right flank of the reserve line, and this is where men of the 1st Battalion of the Essex Regiment were going to move up in the attack alongside the Newfoundland men. Now, of course, we've heard the story of what happened to the Newfoundland Regiment men as they tried to move forwards into the attack here. The trenches were just becoming absolutely clogged with dead and wounded men. The decision was made for them to climb out of their reserve line trenches in an attempt to move forwards. And of course, we know the devastating effect that that had. If you haven't seen that video, you can watch it on my channel. Over here on the right flank, the men of the Essex had exactly the same challenge. They were struggling to get forwards, but rather than climbing out of their trench, their commanding officer decided to stick with it and move forwards up through the communication trenches. Of course, that became a painfully slow process, and that meant they didn't get up to the front line to go into the attack until about 10:30, 10:45 in the morning. At that point, the first wave went over the top and started to cross no man's land. So the first wave of the Essex moved out into the attack here, and they suffered the exact same fate as all those men who had attacked before them. They were absolutely decimated as they crossed no man's land. Nonetheless, the second wave of that attack still went in, and they suffered the same fate. The decision was made to actually not send the third wave of men into the attack there. Now, that probably saved a lot of lives, because I think it's probably fairly safe to say at this point that if that third wave of the attack had gone in, they were probably going to suffer the same fate as so many other thousands of men here had already been victim of. The men of the 1st Essex, who attacked here on the 1st of July 1916. Now we're just heading out across no man's land, actually to go check out the Ravine cemetery, where we can look at the graves of some of the men that we've talked about. But I just thought I'd stop briefly here, because people often get thrown off a little bit when they walk the park here because of this trench in the middle. This is in the middle of what we've said is no man's land, so why is there a trench here? Well, some of the survivors who laid out here in the shell holes, that could be men of the South Wales Borderers, men in the Border Regiment, Essex, Newfoundland men, who were here in the shell holes hiding for their lives, started to dig and started to connect up some of the shell holes they were in. And that developed the very start of this trench. Later, after the 1st of July, there was a connecting communication trench dug forwards and out here. And then this was turned into a proper full trench, ready for the later attack in November 1916. This became the Wellington Trench, and this is the trench where men of the 51st Highland Division attacked from on the 13th of November 1916. They were going to push forwards. They finally captured Ravine and Beaumont Hamel beyond, but that's going to be a story for another video. Now, I've just stepped into the Ravine cemetery here at Newfoundland Park, and this is a cemetery that was created at the end of the Battle of the Somme. So after the men of the 51st Highland Division had moved through and captured Ravine, they started to clear their casualties off this battlefield. And of course, as they were doing so, they found casualties of the men who had been killed here in July. Now, sadly, you can imagine a lot of those men had laid out there from the 1st of July through till beyond November 1916. And you can imagine what happens to a soldier who lays out there for that long. And so sadly, a huge number of the soldiers in this cemetery are unknown, they're unidentified. But when you come here, you do see a mix of headstones of some of the men that we have talked about. So for example, here we have Private L. Murphy of the Newfoundland Regiment, killed on the 1st of July 1916, along with another man of the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers who attacked a little further over to our right hand side here. We have Sergeant Richard Bevan Richards of the South Wales Borderers, killed here on the 1st of July. We have some men from the 51st Highland Division, of course, and we also have here Private G. Hilton of the Border Regiment, killed on the 1st of July 1916. Now, interestingly, there aren't any Essex men in this cemetery here. I know from doing a little bit of research that there are some of the Essex men who are buried in the Ancre British Cemetery, which is just over the ridge here. And sadly, a big chunk of those guys are named on the Thiepval Memorial to the Missing. So of course, there is a very good chance that some of these unknown headstones here could well be men of the Essex Regiment. Here we have 2 soldiers of the Great War, one unknown soldier from the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers who attacked over on the right, and then another soldier who is unknown altogether, known unto God. So we've just crossed no man's land over to what was the German front line. It wouldn't really feel right to come here and talk about all the units who fought here without just mentioning the Germans that were here as well. So we're just out here by the German front line, and over there behind us you can kind of see that big dip where the trees are. That is the Ravine. Well, the German unit that was here was the 119th Infantry Reserve Regiment, and they had been here since autumn 1914. Now, they were a Württemberg unit, men recruited largely from the Stuttgart area, so not quite like a PALS battalion, I guess, but almost like that. German guys from largely from the same area around Stuttgart, and they had rehearsed defending this area again and again. They had trained to be able to bring their machine guns up to the point of the attack and be ready to defend it within about 15 minutes. So on the 1st of July, that's exactly what happened. You would have had sentries out here who would have called that they felt the attack was coming. The bombardment had stopped, which was a big giveaway, and the British started crossing no man's land, exactly like they had trained to do. Those Stuttgart men came forwards, they set up their machine guns here, and they started firing across no man's land. We know the devastating effect that had on the British troops that were attacking here. But just wanted to touch on the Germans who served here, the Stuttgart men who had been here and knew this ground intimately and had trained to defend it. They did so on the 1st of July, fighting for their lives as well, sadly costing so many British casualties out here in no man's land. So I hope you guys found this one interesting, taking a look at some of the other units that fought here at Newfoundland Park. Of course, we're going to carry on here. We've got a video coming soon about the 51st Highland Division that we mentioned just a minute ago. Hopefully you guys will enjoy that one. But in the meantime, I just thought telling that story of some of those guys who are often less talked about when people come here. And that's understandable. The young guides who are here are, of course, part of the foundation to talk about the Newfoundland Regiment. And that's quite right. But I thought I'd come here and spend a little time talking about some of the other guys who fought here. I hope you found it interesting. If you did, do me a favour, do all the YouTube stuff right here on the screen. If you'd like to support what I do here on the channel, you can do that in a few different ways. You can find it in the description. The most helpful way is if you check out my Patreon page. I really appreciate you guys who do. I've got some people on there already, and I'm very grateful. Thank you very much. In the meantime, guys, thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you on the next one.